Now, it's an argument I hear quite often lately, and usually as some type of, defense of modern Star Wars. When someone starts talking about how it has some issues here in the Disney era, they'll say that actually the original Star Wars film, now usually referred to as A New Hope, though once it was indeed just called Star Wars, they'll say it actually isn't all that great of a movie. That it has plenty of problems that are ignored or overlooked today because of nostalgia, and if it were held up to modern standards, the standards of those who criticize modern Star Wars or modern films in general, that if it were overanalyzed, if you will, it'd be found to be too campy and cheesy, or too kind of childish and silly, too full of plot holes and or contrivances and tropes, and in general, it'd be a pretty flawed film. And so what I want to do in this video, and it's probably going to turn into a short series of videos, there's a lot to cover, and mainly I'm going to talk about this belief that Star Wars, the original Star Wars movie, is not a serious film, or that it's very childish and campy. Anyway, I'm going to try and look at A New Hope not only as objectively as I possibly can, but also aiming to be a bit nitpicky, though still fair, which is how I generally try to approach reviewing things anyway. And before even getting started, yes, I will admit that's not exactly going to be the easiest thing I've ever done, considering this film is so ingrained not just in my mind, but my childhood, that I've seen it who knows how many times, and that it's always just been there in my memory, that I don't even recall the first time I saw the first Star Wars movie. And so yeah, it's going to be hard to kind of compartmentalize all that and step back and look at it with fresh eyes, you could say. Either way, and as I was just saying, let's start by addressing the idea that the first Star Wars film is kind of this cheesy or campy movie that would be considered bad or too childish and too corny by today's standards, that it isn't taking itself seriously, that it's just not a serious movie in general. And so first of all, I do think that when you look at the movie on the whole, Star Wars is certainly a very fun story and adventure. It does give you a good feeling in the end, and that feeling was one of the keys to its success, coming out in a time when most sci-fi was sort of bleak and or dystopian in nature, or that was rather grim and took itself very, very seriously, and, well, it didn't have much in the way of fun in it. And thus, maybe in the context of its time, it could be therefore, in a way, considered kind of campy, keeping in mind campy means when you sort of intentionally exaggerate elements of a theme or genre to be more fun and humorous, which when compared to something like, say, 2001: A Space Odyssey, for example, it could be said that Star Wars is campy compared to that. Though that said, I don't think it was ever intended to be campy, or that taken out of that context, it would or should be considered as such today. I do think, and Lucas himself has talked about this, that it was intended to move away from the darker, bleak tone most sci-fi films had at the time, to buck that trend a bit, but not to mock it or make light or fun of those other films of the time, especially when you consider that Lucas himself had made his own dystopian sci-fi film a few years earlier. I also wouldn't say it doesn't take itself seriously or was meant to be nothing more than frivolous and fun. Again, we have multiple examples of George Lucas talking about the deeper themes under the surface, the hero's journey, and that he wanted to make a sort of coming-of-age story, that he created the Force because he wanted to reinvigorate spirituality in the young without endorsing any one particular religion. And yet, especially with the recent release of Andor, I'm hearing a lot of people talk about how serious that show is compared to previous Star Wars, that it's the most adult and grounded Star Wars we have ever seen, which has some people rejoicing, saying that is exactly what the franchise needs right now, and others saying it's missing that Star Wars feeling, that it forgets to be or focus more on fun, like Star Wars is supposed to or should, like it originally was in that first film. And though, yeah, I do think an argument could be absolutely made that Andor will potentially be the grittiest and the most mature and grounded Star Wars we've ever seen, the argument that Star Wars is nothing but fun or always leaves you feeling good, which I talked about in a video the other day, ignores the fact that most of the best or most highly regarded Star Wars was quite grim and dark. The Empire Strikes Back, widely considered the best of the Star Wars films, is the perfect example of this. However, it's not like that first Star Wars film was all fun and high adventure, that it didn't have its darker moments, and some quite horrible moments when you really stop and think about it. And to say that it didn't take itself seriously, that it was cheesy and childish, that it would be dismissed today for being too silly or something, is to ignore, well, pretty much the whole film. I mean, how many fun, frivolous kids' movies open with the good guys being mowed down by laser fire, followed soon after by Darth Vader choking someone to death, literally crushing their throat? And what about the part where we learn Jawas were slaughtered by stormtroopers, or when we see the charred corpses of Luke's aunt and uncle, who were most likely burned alive? What about Obi-Wan killing one person and slicing off the arm of another, or the part where Han shoots Greedo and casually walks out of the cantina as if it should be no big deal?
Sorry about the mess.
Yeah.
Certainly one of the good guys committing what you could call gun violence like that would not be dismissed, if not almost glorified, in a kid's film today. And what about a woman, Princess Leia, being tortured for information by Darth Vader? Then there's that part where, an entire planet is blown up and millions, if not, for all we know at the time, potentially billions of people die instantly. We also have the battle at the end where most of the good guys are shot down and killed, and where hundreds of thousands or more people end up dying when the Death Star is destroyed. And sure, they were the bad guys, but that's still a pretty high body count for a kids' film. And so, certainly with all these grim scenes of death and destruction, there must be plenty of more childish elements in the film to not only counterbalance all that, but to make it a corny or campy or whatever else some might want to call it film. And I guess you could point at R2 and 3PO, though I've always thought, especially in that first film, in A New Hope, that 3PO does come off rather harsh and a bit of a dick.
I've just about had enough of you. Go that way. You'll be malfunctioning within a day, you nearsighted scrap pile. And don't let me catch you following me, begging for help, because you won't get it.
It's never surprised me that there are more fans out there who like R2 over 3PO. Regardless, there's really no overt or intentionally childish humor that stems from the droids or, honestly, anything else in the film. That's not to say nothing is funny in there, but there's nothing that you'd be able to point at and say that's in there just for kids to find amusing. And sure, back in the day, a lot of kids were absolutely fascinated, if not completely enthralled, by the droids and probably laughed and smiled at them, the same way I'm sure a lot of really young kids today would smile and laugh at them, or at anything else like them. But that's the thing, there really wasn't anything else quite like them back then, or not that came in the whole package that Star Wars did, with plenty of other wondrous and cool things like ships, interesting aliens, lightsabers, and so on. All of those things were unlike anything else seen before. Star Wars itself was very different from anything else that had ever come out. It had no rival or anything else to even compare itself to, and thus it captured the imagination of an entire generation of kids. Which is why I think it oftentimes gets thought of as childish or not a serious film, because it did resonate with nearly any and every child who watched it back then. There are so many today who have childhood memories attached to that movie, which then impacts the way they, of course, think and feel about that movie. But I don't think when, again, you really stop and think about it or look at it, that it had overtly childish or cheesy elements to it, that it wasn't a serious movie or didn't have darker moments or a real and gritty feel to it. In fact, I think one of the main reasons why so many adults liked it back then is because it was a rather serious and kind of gritty film that still managed to have fun and felt uplifting in the end. And the reason why some of the original trilogy fans didn't like the prequels when they came out is because the prequels, especially Episode 1 with Jar Jar and not so much Episode 3, but they did feel more like kids' movies. They did have more overt childish elements or humor aimed at a younger audience. And that actually felt pretty foreign to Star Wars after the original trilogy. And I know some are immediately going to bring up the Ewoks in Return of the Jedi, though I don't think they were quite as blatant as what Jar Jar would eventually be. Certainly, just the cute, cuddly nature of Ewoks did appeal to young children. I remember liking Ewoks when I watched the movie for the first time at the age of 5. But I don't know how intentionally, in story at least, that was exploited. I don't know how many things you can point at in the movie that's just meant to get a kid to want a parent to buy them an Ewok toy, beyond them again just being what they are. And I mean, we do see an Ewok die on screen, and it's implied many, many more perished in the Battle of Endor, so there is a darker aspect to their inclusion, and that's to say nothing of them being implied to eat people as well. And so I honestly do think one of the reasons why Star Wars gets thought of by some as this non-serious kids movie is because, for one, the prequels did to a degree kind of skew the feeling or perception of Star Wars, and mind you, I am someone who very much enjoys the prequels. I'm completely fine with what they were. There's also George Lucas flat out always saying that they're poor kids, so that also does give you an impression, I believe. And for some, for pretty much all who grew up with it, Star Wars is their childhood. It is so entwined in it is so magical to them that they see it as the movie that defined their childhood, which leads us to a couple of questions. One being, is it still magical today? Do kids these days, would they watch it and become as enthralled as kids back then did? And just because, yes, I do believe it is a serious movie, it's not just some kind of overt film for kids, does it hold up to getting a bit more nitpicky? Are there plot holes and contrivances that we didn't see back then that would be glaring today? Or would it be called cliché if it came out today? And I do hope to answer those questions in an upcoming video. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think. Is the original Star Wars film childish? Is it campy and corny? Or is it just that it has a reputation earned due to the circumstances around its release and what it means to an entire generation of kids? Whatever you think, leave your comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.